Pricing metrics. This is the second video in a four-part series on picking a SaaS pricing metric. The first one was on operational viability, so check that out if you haven't seen it yet. This one, I focus a little bit on explaining how a pricing metric tracks value with your customer and how that value can be translated into pricing and monetization for your software solution. So the first thing to notice is that we want to track value, but that is not all we want to do. So if we are having a software solution that provides some sort of value, maybe we have an AI platform for banks or something similar, users are going to track value, but they are not going to be valuable. So the distinction is that users are required to generate value with the software solution. So you do have a relationship where more users equal more value, but that doesn't mean that there is demand for these users. Similar you have often with design software. So it's one of the core problems of Adobe is that Adobe will sell user licenses, but what will happen is that the agencies that are the majority customers of Adobe software will buy a few licenses, share them around with logins, and not really buy more users in and of itself, because it's not really what generates the value. It is the usage or the outcome at the other end of the solution that generates the value. So we can definitely have something that tracks and correlates with value, but isn't really a good pricing metric. So that's the key issue that we want to unpack here and that I want to explain to you. The first thing that we want to do when we're trying to figure out how to pick a pricing metric that actually tracks demand and not only value with the software that we're delivering is to build a sort of simple representation of your customer's value chain. So let me give you an example. So let's say that you're selling an AI platform to a financial institution like an insurance company or a bank. So this AI solution maybe can support the bank taking data in, doing some calculations through algorithms, and outputting some sort of measurement or benchmark to power credit scores or do trades or some other things. Okay, if you lay out the bank's value proposition for using your solution, it will be something like, we need to establish a unit that does AI. So that unit is going to have a team and a budget. And then that unit is going to then source data inside the bank. So it's going to find all the different data sources. It's going to build some business cases. It's going to do different things. Then they're going to train models and run these models. Those models, I think some of them will be deployed within the operations of the bank. And then once deployed, they will generate some outputs that improves a KPI. Okay, so that is a value creation process within your bank customer when using your solution. Now, at each of these steps in this value chain, we will be able to measure different things. So at the beginning, we will be able to measure, let's say, AI budget, perhaps, or number of users on the solution. At the next step, we will be able to measure data sources or total data throughput in terms of gigabyte or queries or some form of that. Then we will be able to measure, let's say, the number of models, maybe the number of models total, and then the number of models deployed. So that's a subset of total models. And then at the final end, maybe we measure some sort of output. In the previous video, I talked about operational viability. And if you list all of these different measurements that you could make at each of these steps in the value chain, you'll quickly find out that some of them are not operationally viable. So maybe you can't measure the customer's AI budget because they're not going to tell you, but you could measure the number of users they have. So out of the total list of potential things to measure across a customer value chain, some of them will be operationally viable and some will not. Just throw away the ones that are not and just keep the ones that are, and then look at where they are placed in the value chain. So in this example I just gave you, users are placed at the very beginning of the value chain, hence they're an input. They're something that the bank commits as a resource to generating the value throughout the process of the value chain to get to the output, which is the credit scores or the trades or whatever it is that your solution does, right? So let me give you another example. I did a project for some HR software, recruiting software last year for Dutch, it's not really a startup, relatively big HR solution provider. And so this would power up different, let's say, forms and interfaces that recruitment companies could use to source candidates and extract information from them, like sending them questionnaires and prompts and so forth, right? So we would have a solution where we'd say, okay, so we have a number of users in the recruitment companies, And then all these users in the recruitment companies are spinning up forms and questionnaires and sending out messages that then land with candidates. And then the candidates reply to some of them, and some of them even apply to jobs. Jobs are then filled, and then hours are worked, and then the recruitment companies make money, right? So this is another example of a value chain process where in the beginning we have users of a particular piece of software that generate forms and prompts and surveys and so forth. And then we have the actual applications, number of forms, number of prompts, number of surveys that are then filled by number of candidates and then ends up in filled positions that ends up in hours worked, of which the recruitment companies take a cut. So again, we have a value creation process with an input, users that go through number of forms, number of candidates, number of replies or touches, or let's say interactions with candidates, and then finally into hours worked and money made. That's the output. If we pick a pricing metric that measures something at the beginning of the customer's value chain, we are going to be seen as a cost input. So the customer is going to assume that, okay, we are making users more expensive. In both these examples, users at the beginning of the value chain. That's not always the case. With Slack, for example, their active users are actually more at the end of Slack's value chain. But in these two examples I gave you with the AI solution for banks and the HR software, users at the beginning. But if we price, let's say, with the AI software on, let's say, models deployed or credit scores output, something like that, we're at the end of the value chain. Or with the HR software, we price based on candidates touched or positions filled, we're at the end of the value chain. So in this instance, the customer is much more likely to see us as participating in the actual outcome or the value being generated by the solution, which is much more likely to have a positive effect because it is the outcome that the customer actually wants. So the customer does not want more users. If you ask them, how many users do you want? They will say, as few as possible. I just need to power my value chain. Well, how many data sources do you want in your AI models? Well, how many do I need? I need as few as possible to generate my credit scores. Well, how many forms do you want? Well, as few as possible in order to fill my positions. Well, how many positions do you want filled? As many as possible. I want all the positions filled. If you can give me more, I would like those. Well, how many data outputs do you want? Well, if they're of a good quality, I want all of the ones I can have because I want every one of my credit scores to be optimized by AI. So what we can see is that there really isn't demand at the beginning of a value chain, even though the users and the data sources or the forms correlates to the outputs, which is the job positions filled or the credit scores crunched or whatever it is. So by mapping out the customer's value chain, looking at each step of the chain and seeing what you can measure at each step, you actually get a really good overview of the potential pricing metrics that you could power your solution with. So you remove the ones that are not operationally viable, that you can't actually measure. So that was step one in the last video. But in this step, you simply draw up the value chain, put in all the different measurements that you can make at each step of the chain of the value creation process with your customer. And then you essentially look towards the end and see what over here would make sense for me to price by. Okay, pro tip. If any one of the measurements that you have put up match more or less exactly with a KPI of your customer, let's say that in the examples I have, we have some sort of a KPI that says positions filled or candidates enriched with new data, or in the HR example, then it's pretty likely that that particular pricing metric will be a very high value because the customer has already realized its value. So you're not faced with the communication hurdle of explaining it to them why it is important because they already know. They're already using this internally to measure the value output of the process that they're running. So create the value chain, list at each step all the things that you can measure, look towards the end, look for KPIs that the customer is already using in this area of their value creation process, and then pick those. If you want to do a ranking, you can also simply sort of break it down into sort of 1 to 5 steps, like 1 being not a lot of demand very early in the value chain, and 5 being very high in demand, clearly recognized as a KPI by the customer, something like that. So you'll have sort of a numerical scale to measure the pricing metrics by that is output by the value chain. This will be apparent later in the process when I show you the two next videos, one on the expectation to pay metric, which trips up the value a little bit. So there's more to the story than simply value. There's also something called expectation to pay, which is a measure of transparency and fairness that customers do care about. And then there's metric density, which is a measure of how well that particular metric actually sort of tracks value generation in a, let's say, systematic fashion without a lot of variance. So I'll get into those two a little bit later, but for now, if you take your pricing metrics and just, let's say, score them 1 to 5, you can do 1 to 10, that's fine, but just create some sort of numerical score from, not very good to very, very good. That will be enough for now. We'll do the same with the two other measurements on density and expectation to pay, and you'll see the beauty unfold. Okay, stay tuned.